Good evening and welcome back to Starlight Sleep Tales. Most of the empires we discuss on this channel collapse slowly, eroded by decades of internal contradiction, external pressure, the slow grinding of fiscal failure, and military overextension, until the end came not as a single dramatic rupture, but as the final acknowledgement of a process that had been underway for a long time. Tonight we are discussing an empire that did not collapse slowly. Tonight we're discussing an empire that was, by almost any measure available to the ancient world, the most powerful political and military organization that had ever existed on Earth. An empire whose armies had conquered everything from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, whose kings had built palaces of a scale and splendor that left every contemporary observer struggling for adequate description, whose engineers had constructed aqueducts and irrigation systems of genuine sophistication, whose libraries had assembled the intellectual production of a civilization going back 2,000 years. And that went from the height of that power to complete, total, physical obliteration in approximately 15 years. Not decline, not transformation, obliteration. The cities burned, the population was dispersed, the palaces were buried under the rubble of their own collapse. The language eventually died. And when the Greek armies marched through the region 2 centuries later, they passed the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud without recognizing what they were walking past, without knowing that beneath the grass-covered mounds lay the remains of cities that had once been the administrative centers of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. That is the story of the Assyrian Empire, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the ancient world. Not only for what the Assyrians built, which was genuinely remarkable, not only for how they governed, which was genuinely innovative and genuinely brutal in equal measure, not only for the specific quality of their military machine, which was the most sophisticated instrument of organized violence the Bronze and early Iron Age world had produced, but for what their collapse tells us about the specific fragility of power when it rests on fear rather than consent, on the systematic destruction of alternatives rather than the cultivation of a loyalty, on an engine of expansion that cannot stop expanding without immediately beginning to fall apart. So, before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is genuinely what you come here for, and as always, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. The image of this story settling over different time zones at the same moment, some of you deep in the night and some of you just ending a long day, is one I always find quietly wonderful. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go soft. Let the breath slow down. And let us go back, much further back than we usually go, to the river valleys of what the ancients called the land between the rivers, to the place where civilization first cohered into something recognizable, and to the particular city on the upper Tigris, whose name became synonymous across 3,000 years of history with conquest and cruelty and power and ruin. The land we are entering tonight is Mesopotamia, the Greek word for the land between rivers, specifically the Tigris and the Euphrates, which rise in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey and flow southeast toward the Persian Gulf, draining a watershed that encompasses most of modern Iraq and significant portions of Syria, Turkey, and Iran. The Tigris and Euphrates are not gentle rivers. They flood unpredictably, carry heavy silt loads, and historically created conditions in their lower reaches that were simultaneously enormously productive. The alluvial soil deposited by centuries of flooding was among the most fertile agricultural land in the world, and extremely difficult to manage. The agricultural surplus that Mesopotamia's river-fed soils could produce was the foundation on which everything else was built. The cities, the temples, the armies, the writing, the law codes, the entire apparatus of what we recognize as civilization in its earliest forms. Writing itself was invented in Mesopotamia in the Sumerian city-states of the south around 3200 BCE. Invented not for poetry or prayer, but for accountancy, for the recording of grain deliveries and livestock transfers and temple revenues that a complex urban economy required. The specific form that writing took in Mesopotamia, cuneiform, from the Latinal. For wedge-shaped, referring to the wedge-shaped impressions that a reed stylus made in wet clay, remained the dominant writing technology of the ancient Near East for 3,000 years. Used to write not only Sumerian, but Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Elamite, Hittite, and several other ancient languages, adapting to grammatical structures and phonetic systems very different from the Sumerian it was invented to represent. The clay tablets on which cuneiform was written have proven to be among the most durable archival media in the history of human record-keeping. Fired in the same conflagrations that destroyed the buildings that housed them, the tablets were actually preserved by the fires that killed everything around them, and tens of thousands of them survive in museums around the world, giving historians of the ancient Near East a documentary record of unusual density and specificity. Assyria, specifically, was the region of northern Mesopotamia, centered on the upper Tigris River, in the area around what is now the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. The city that gave the empire its name was Ashur, named for the god Ashur, who was simultaneously the city's patron deity and the empire's supreme divine authority, a theological arrangement that made the king's military campaigns simultaneously political acts and religious obligations. The city of Ashur sat on a promontory overlooking the Tigris, with natural defensive advantages that made it a natural center of power in the region. And the community that grew there was trading and culturally engaged with the broader Mesopotamian world from its earliest phases. The Old Assyrian period, running from roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, was characterized primarily by Assyrian merchants operating an extensive trade network across Anatolia, what is now Turkey, carrying tin and textiles from Assyria to Anatolian cities, and returning with silver and gold. A commercial enterprise documented in the thousands of clay tablets found at the ancient Assyrian trading colony of Kultepe in central Turkey, which preserved the business correspondence of merchants who were doing something very recognizable as long-distance wholesale trade approximately 4,000 years ago. The Mesopotamia that Assyria emerged from and competed within was not a stable or peaceful environment. It was a world of competing city-states and regional powers whose political arrangements shifted constantly through war and alliance and dynastic change. And the specific history of the second millennium BCE in Mesopotamia is complicated enough that even specialists find it demanding. The great Babylonian Empire of the early second millennium, the Empire of Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon around 1750 BCE, and whose law code is one of the most famous documents of the ancient world, had dominated the region for a period before its own decline and eventual conquest by the Kassites, a people of uncertain origin who ruled Babylon for several centuries with less drama than their predecessors. The Hittite Empire of Anatolia, the Mitanni Kingdom of northern Syria, the emerging power of Egypt in the southwest, these were the great powers of the second millennium Near East. And Assyria in this period was a regional power of moderate strength, sometimes independent, sometimes subordinate to one of the greater powers, building its institutional and military capacity through centuries of engagement with the complex political world around it. The specific moment at which Assyria began its transformation from regional power to imperial superpower is usually located in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from approximately 1114 to 1076 BCE, and who conducted military campaigns of a scale and geographic range that his predecessors had not attempted. Campaigns into Anatolia, into the Zagros Mountains, to the Mediterranean coast in Syria that announced Assyrian military ambition on a new register. But Tiglath-Pileser's empire did not last. The end of the second millennium BCE was a period of widespread collapse across the eastern Mediterranean. The late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic and still not fully explained civilizational disruptions in the history of the ancient world, which destroyed the Hittite Empire, severely damaged Egypt, and disrupted the palace economies of the Aegean with a speed and completeness that left historians of the 20th century CE struggling to find adequate explanations. Assyria survived this collapse in diminished form, and the centuries between approximately 1050 and 900 BCE were a period of relative weakness and contraction, from which the empire that would eventually achieve genuine world historical significance would slowly and then rapidly emerge. The Mesopotamia we're entering tonight is the world's oldest civilization in the sense that the specific forms of social organization, the city, the state, the written law, the organized priesthood, the professional army, the long-distance trade network, first took recognizable shape here and spread outward from here to the rest of the world. This is not the only place that civilization developed independently. China, India, Egypt, Mesoamerica all developed complex urban societies through processes that had indigenous roots. But it is the place where the earliest datable urban civilization appeared, and the specific achievements of Mesopotamian civilization in its first 2,000 years before the Assyrian Empire are the foundation on which the Assyrian achievement rested and should be understood. The city-states of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu were the first cities in the world, and the organizational forms they developed to manage the problems of urban life set precedents that the subsequent civilizations of the Near East built on directly. The temple complex at the center of each Sumerian city was not only a religious institution, but the economic and administrative center of the community. It managed the agricultural land, processed and stored the grain harvest, employed the craftsmen whose products the urban economy required, maintained the scribal school where writing was taught, and administrative record were kept. The earliest known texts in human history are the temple accounting records from Uruk, dating to approximately 3200 BCE. Records of grain rations, lists of personnel, tallies of animals produced by the institution that was simultaneously the house of the city's god and the government of the city's economy. What this means for the Assyrian story is that the administrative sophistication, the scribal tradition, the legal framework, and the religious institutions that the Neo-Assyrian Empire deployed were not Assyrian inventions. They were inherited, adapted, and applied on a new scale. The Assyrian provincial system that Tiglath-Pileser III developed drew on 3,000 years of Mesopotamian experience with how to organize a territorial administration. The Assyrian legal tradition drew on the Code of Hammurabi and the Sumerian and Akkadian legal traditions that preceded it. The Assyrian scribal schools taught a curriculum developed in the Sumerian scribal schools of the 3rd millennium. The Assyrian kings, who legitimized their rule through the performance of Babylonian religious rituals, were acknowledging that the prestige of the older civilization could not simply be conquered. It had to be incorporated. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, the period from approximately 911 BCE, when Adad-Nirari II began the systematic expansion that would eventually produce the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen, to 609 BCE, when the last vestige of Assyrian political organization was extinguished, is the empire we are primarily here to discuss tonight. And it is worth understanding from the outset that this was not a simple or monotonous story of continuous expansion. It had phases of aggressive expansion and phases of consolidation, kings of extraordinary ability and kings of devastating inadequacy, military innovations that changed the nature of warfare in the ancient Near East, and administrative innovations that changed the nature of governance, moments of cultural achievement of genuine brilliance, and moments of violence so systematic and so total that the records the Assyrians themselves left behind are among the most comprehensive documents of organized atrocity in the ancient world. The engine of Neo-Assyrian power was its army, and the army deserves careful attention because it was genuinely revolutionary in the context of the ancient Near East. The armies of the ancient world before the Neo-Assyrian period were primarily forces of the campaigning season. They assembled for a specific campaign, fought it, and then dispersed with the soldiers returning to their agricultural and craft occupations during the rest of the year. The logistical and organizational demands of keeping a large professional force in the field continuously were beyond what most ancient states could manage, and the tactical sophistication that continuous service and training produces was therefore largely absent from ancient Near Eastern warfare before the Assyrians. The Neo-Assyrian kings created something. Chariots served as a mobile firing platform for archers, was the most prestigious arm and the one most closely associated with the king himself, who typically fought from a chariot in the early Assyrian military tradition. The cavalry proper, mounted archers and lancers who could operate in terrain that chariots could not manage, grew in importance across the Neo-Assyrian period as the empire expanded into the mountainous terrain of the north and east, where wheeled vehicles were less effective. The infantry, organized into units of spearmen, archers, and shield-bearers, formed the mass of the army and was trained in the aggressive close-quarters combat that the Assyrian tactical tradition emphasized. And the siege engineers, perhaps the most distinctive and most consequential component of the Assyrian military system, provided the capability to reduce fortified cities that most ancient armies could not match. Siege warfare was the great military challenge of the ancient Near East, and the reason for this is straightforward. The primary defensive technology available to ancient cities was the mud brick or stone wall, and a well-built, well-provisioned city behind strong walls could resist almost indefinitely against an army that lacked the means to breach those walls. Most ancient armies dealt with this problem by siege, surrounding the city, cutting off its supply lines, and waiting for starvation to do what assault could not. This worked eventually, but it required keeping an army in the field for months or years, consuming enormous resources, and exposing the besieging force to the same supply problems it was trying to impose on the defenders. The Assyrians developed a far more aggressive approach. Their siege engineers built ramps of earth and stone against the walls of the siege cities, allowing battering rams, sophisticated machines of wood and metal that the Assyrians developed into increasingly effective instruments to reach the walls and batter through them. They dug tunnels beneath the walls, undermining the foundations. They used scaling ladders and coordinated mass assaults that accepted heavy casualties in exchange for rapid reduction of the objective. And they used fire systematically against gates and wooden structural elements in ways that converted well-built structures into vulnerabilities rather than defenses. The combination of these siege capabilities with the mobile striking power of the cavalry and chariot corps made the Assyrian army a force that could both fix enemy forces in their cities and threaten them in the field simultaneously. A tactical flexibility that ancient Near Eastern warfare had not previously seen. The specific technological advantage that the Assyrians exploited most effectively was iron, which had been becoming progressively more available across the early first millennium BCE. As the techniques of iron smelting spread from their Anatolian origins across the Near East, iron weapons and iron-tipped tools were harder and more durable than the bronze equivalents they replaced. And the Assyrian army's early and extensive adoption of iron technology gave it a material advantage over opponents who were slower to make the transition. The experience of Assyrian conquest from the perspective of the conquered, what it meant to be on the receiving end of the machine we have been describing, is something that the Assyrian sources, with their celebration of victory and their careful documentation of atrocities, illuminate from one side while other ancient sources illuminate from the other. The biblical texts that deal with Assyrian conquest, the books of Isaiah, Amos, Micah, Kings, and Chronicles, are among the most vivid and emotionally immediate accounts of what it felt like to live in the shadow of the Assyrian Empire. And they give a human texture to the political and military history that the royal annals focused on the king's achievements systematically suppress. The experience of the small kingdoms of the Syro-Palestinian corridor, Israel, Judah, Damascus, the Phoenician cities, the Philistine city-states, was shaped by their specific geographic position on the route between Assyria and Egypt. The two great powers whose competition for the region made it perpetually contested and perpetually threatened. These kingdoms had enough political sophistication to understand what they were dealing with. The Assyrian Empire's size and military capability were not mysteries to people who had watched their neighbors be conquered one by one. And their responses ranged from early submission and tribute paying to coalition building and resistance to the desperate appeals to Egypt that the Assyrian kings found particularly infuriating and that rarely produced the Egyptian military assistance they were hoping for. The prophet Isaiah, writing in Jerusalem in the late 8th century BCE, during exactly the period of maximum Assyrian pressure on Judah, describes the Assyrian army in terms that capture the specific terror it produced in the people who watched it advance. A great force that comes like a flood, that does not weary, that does not stumble, that comes quickly and swiftly, none of them tired or stumbling, none slumbering or sleeping, not a belt loosened at the waist, not a sandal strap broken. The specificity of the description, the belt, the sandal strap, suggests someone who had seen or heard accounts of Assyrian troops on the march and was trying to convey the quality of their discipline to an audience that needed to understand what the threat actually consisted of. The ordinary populations of conquered territories experienced the Assyrian Empire primarily through two mechanisms: tribute extraction and the possibility of deportation. The tribute demands that Assyrian kings extracted from vassal states were, by the standards of the period, heavy. Silver and gold in specified quantities, horses and mules for the army, luxury goods that demonstrated the vassal submission and the Assyrian king's wealth, grain and other provisions that supported the military machine. These demands were not optional and not negotiable in the sense that the modern word implies. They were enforced by the specific. Understanding that failure to pay invited the military response that everyone had seen applied to the predecessors who had failed to pay. The calculation that every vassal king made, whether the cost of payment was less than the cost of the military response that non-payment would provoke, was the fundamental political decision of life on the Assyrian imperial periphery. And the records show that most of them, most of the time, chose payment over resistance. The specific experience of deportation, which the Assyrian records document from the deportee's perspective as an administrative act, a management tool, a demonstration of royal power, was experienced by the deported as a catastrophe. A destruction of everything that gave life meaning, the land, the community, the shrines and tombs and familiar landscapes that constituted home. The Psalms of the Hebrew Bible include what may be the most concentrated literary expression of what deportation felt like from inside. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" The poem is specifically about the Babylonian deportation of Judah in 586 BCE, a generation after the Assyrian Empire's fall, but it captures the emotional reality of a deportation experience that the Assyrians had been applying across the Near East for a century and a half before the Babylonians continued the practice. The psychological dimension of Assyrian warfare was as deliberate and as systematic as the physical one. The Assyrians understood with the clarity that a military culture produces when it has been fighting for centuries that the fear of what they would do was itself a military asset. That a city that surrendered without fighting could be managed as a tribute-paying vassal, while a city that resisted had to be made into an example that would deter the next city from doing the same. The records they left, the royal annals inscribed on the walls of their palaces, the victory monuments set up in conquered territories, the best reliefs that decorated the throne rooms where foreign ambassadors were received, documented their atrocities with the specificity and a pride that served precisely this deterrent function. The flayed bodies displayed on the walls of conquered cities, the impaled prisoners lining the roads into the capitals, the severed heads piled at the feet of the victorious king. These were not incidental byproducts of warfare. They were policy. They were communications addressed to every king and every city in the region who might be considering resistance, and the communication was clear. The cost of fighting the Assyrian army is this. The cost of surrendering is tribute and submission. Calculate accordingly. Before we follow the kings through their specific achievements, it is worth understanding the religious and theological framework within which those achievements were understood and legitimized. Because Assyrian kingship was not in its own self-understanding purely a political institution. It was a theological one, and the specific theology of Assyrian royal power shaped everything from the language of the royal inscriptions to the design of the palace reliefs to the specific way in which military campaigns were conceived and conducted. The god Ashur was the supreme deity of the Assyrian pantheon and the theological center of Assyrian royal ideology. He was, in a sense that has no perfect modern equivalent, simultaneously the patron deity of the city of Ashur, the supreme god of the entire Assyrian pantheon, the divine embodiment of the Assyrian state, and the ultimate source of the authority that legitimized Assyrian kingship and Assyrian expansion. The king of Assyria was, in the theological formulation that the royal inscriptions expressed repeatedly, the king whose reign Ashur had decreed, the instrument through whom Ashur exercised his will in the human world, the servant of Ashur who carried out divine commands rather than his own ambitions. The military campaigns that the Assyrian army conducted were, in this framework, not acts of human aggression or greed, but acts of divine will. Ashur had commanded the subjugation of the lands, had designated the peoples to be conquered, had determined the extent of the empire that he wanted his human representative to build and maintain. This theology served obvious political functions. It made resistance to Assyrian expansion not merely politically futile, but theologically transgressive. You were not just fighting an army, you were resisting the will of the supreme God, which was impious and inevitably futile. It provided a divine mandate for every atrocity that the campaigns committed. If the god had commanded the campaign, then everything the campaign entailed was divinely authorized. And the documentation of those atrocities in the royal inscriptions was not a record of crimes, but a record of divine will being executed. And it provided a narrative framework within which even Assyrian setbacks, the occasional defeat, the campaign that did not achieve its objectives, the vassal that successfully rebelled, could be incorporated without undermining the fundamental claim. The temporary setback was evidence of the king's own impiety or the wrath of specific offended deities, not evidence that Ashur's will could be permanently thwarted. The Assyrian Divine Council, the assembly of the major gods whose collective will govern the cosmos, was the theological parallel to the Assyrian royal court, and the parallels were not accidental. The Assyrian king performed specific rituals that maintained the relationship between the human political order and the divine order that it mirrored. The New Year festival, the Akitu, which celebrated the renewal of the king's relationship with Ashur and the other major deities, the ritual of taking the hand of Marduk in Babylonia, the specific omen interpretations that guided royal decision-making by, revealing the will of the gods through celestial and terrestrial signs, the professional diviners who interpreted the omens, the Baru, the specialists in reading the liver of sacrificed animals, the movements of celestial bodies, and the occurrence of unusual natural events were among the most important and most influential figures in the Assyrian royal court, because their interpretations determined whether a proposed military campaign had divine support and therefore whether it should proceed. The library that Ashurbanipal's assembled contained large numbers of omen texts precisely because the systematic knowledge of what the gods communicated through natural signs was an administrative necessity rather than a theological curiosity. The king needed to know whether the moment was auspicious for a campaign or a construction project or a diplomatic initiative. In the accumulated experience of centuries of Babylonian and Assyrian observation of celestial and terrestrial phenomena was the database from which that knowledge was extracted. The Omen series called Enuma Anu Enlil, named from its opening words, meaning when Anu and Enlil runs to approximately 70 tablets and contains thousands of omen formulas correlating celestial observations with predicted outcomes. It is simultaneously a religious text, a scientific text, in the ancient sense of a systematic empirical record, and an administrative manual for royal decision-making. The specific kings who built the Neo-Assyrian Empire into its mature form deserve individual attention because the empire was not an impersonal machine, but a set of specific institutional and military achievements produced by specific men whose characters and abilities shaped what Assyria became. Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, is in many respects the founder of the empire in its mature form. The king who established the specific combination of military aggression, administrative sophistication, and propagandistic display that would characterize the Neo-Assyrian state at its height. His annals, preserved in the inscriptions on the walls of his new capital at Nimrud, ancient Kala, which he built from the ground up on the Tigris south of the old capital of Ashur, are among the most detailed and most disturbing royal documents of the ancient world, combining genuine military history with descriptions of atrocities against conquered populations that are presented as virtuous as evidence of royal power, as proof of the king's divinely authorized ability to punish those who had defied Assyrian authority. He campaigns into northern Syria, into the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast. He extracts tribute from cities and kingdoms across a vast area. He builds his palace at Nimrud on a scale that had not been seen in the region for centuries, filling it with carved stone reliefs depicting his military campaigns and his hunts, and his ceremonial activities with a programmatic thoroughness that made the palace simultaneously a residence and a political statement. The inauguration of the palace at Nimrud in 879 BCE is documented in an inscription that describes a feast at which Ashurnasirpal hosted approximately 69,574 guests, a number so specific that it has attracted considerable scholarly attention, both as evidence of the logistical achievement it represents and as evidence of the propaganda function that such a number served. The feast lasted 10 days and consumed, according to the inscription, enormous quantities of cattle, sheep, deer, ducks, geese, fish, bread, beer, wine, and sesame oil. Whether the specific numbers are precisely accurate is less important than what the inscription communicates. That the king of Assyria could feed 70,000 people for 10 days, which means the king of Assyria commands resources on a scale that no other ruler in the region could match. And anyone calculating whether to resist or submit to Assyrian authority should factor that resource base into their calculations. Shalmaneser III, who succeeded Ashurnasirpal and ruled from 858 to 824 BCE, continued the expansion his father had begun and extended Assyrian military reach in all directions, with a consistency that suggests both genuine military ability and the institutional momentum of an army and an administrative system that had been designed for continuous campaigning. He fought in Syria repeatedly, coming into conflict with a coalition of Syro-Palestinian states that included the Kingdom of Israel under King Ahab, the same Ahab of the biblical narrative, at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE, a battle whose outcome is somewhat ambiguous in the sources, but that demonstrated that the Western Syro-Palestinian kingdoms were capable of organizing effective resistance when sufficiently threatened. He built his own monuments, his own palaces, and left records of his campaigns on the famous Black Obelisk, a four-sided stone monument now in the British Museum, which depicts, among other things, a bearded foreign king prostrating himself before Shalmaneser to present tribute. The figure has been identified with reasonable confidence as Jehu, king of Israel, making this one of the earliest images of a person named in the Hebrew Bible. After Shalmaneser III, the empire went through a period of relative weakness marked by internal conflict. The rebellion of Shalmaneser's own sons against their father and against each other, a period of instability in which the great Assyrian noble families exercised power that the monarchy was temporarily too weak to constrain. The empire contracted somewhat, and several of the territories that had been brought under Assyrian influence reasserted their independence. This period ended with the reign of Adad-nirari III, who restored central royal authority, and then with a succession of capable kings whose campaigns steadily rebuilt Assyrian power across the late 9th and early 8th centuries. The king who transformed the Neo-Assyrian Empire from a regional superpower into something genuinely world historical was Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BCE, and whose reign represents one of the most productive periods of administrative and military innovation in the empire's history. He came to power through what appears to have been a coup against the reigning king. The circumstances are murky in the sources, which is not surprising given that usurpers are generally disinclined to document their usurpations clearly, and immediately demonstrated the quality that would define his reign. A systematic, comprehensive intelligence that addressed the empire's problems at their structural roots rather than their surface manifestations. The specific problem that Tiglath-Pileser identified and addressed was the relationship between the empire's military reach and its administrative capacity. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had been expanding its military reach for generations, bringing more and more territory under nominal Assyrian authority, but the administrative system through which that authority was exercised was inadequate to the scale of the empire. Conquered territories were often left under their existing rulers, who paid tribute and nominally acknowledged Assyrian overlordship, but who retained the capacity for independence that local rulers always retain when the overlord's administrative presence is thin. The tribute-paying vassal was a perfectly workable arrangement when the empire was small enough that the king's personal military attention could reinforce the vassal relationship regularly. As the empire grew larger and the distances between the king's base and the peripheral territories increased, the vassal arrangement became progressively less stable. The vassals who were farthest from Assyrian military power were most likely to calculate that resistance might be worth attempting. Tiglath-Pileser's solution was the provincial system, the conversion of vassal kingdoms into directly administered provinces under Assyrian governors appointed by and to the king. The provinces paid taxes rather than tribute, were administered according to Assyrian administrative norms rather than the local customs of the previous ruling dynasty, and were connected to the imperial